You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Season 2, Episode 5, written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. The winter snows had come and gone, skipping northward acre by acre, leaving a trail of flowers in her wake, showing the bounty of man's maker. A tang of frost still teased the air until the morning sun chased it away and warmed the day. Birds sang about spring's journey, telling in their own tongue about the adventures and conquests of the season. A fox squirrel looked on with interest as two of its mates played tag up a tree and across a limb among the infant leaves. Bear Claw straightened as the hide door closed behind him, stretched as far as his fingertips would reach, and yawned in the cool morning air. He smiled secretly as he walked to one of the shed-like structures he had built over the graves of Mittig's family. No one intruded on graves. In fact, it was safer than one of those eastern bank vaults. Gifts and food were often left for the departed, and it showed Mittig's neighbors that Bear Claw honored them by taking care of Waving Grass and him while she recuperated. It was convenient that they believed his story about Mittig's family losing their lives to the same fever that almost killed Waving Grass. He looked around to ensure his solitude and lifted the planks from the end of one of the sheds. He slid the first of two large bales of beaver pelts out into the sunlight, followed by the other. He then replaced the planks and used a limb to brush away the drag marks. He shivered as he passed the little grave at the end of the row of 5. It was the one that Mittig had built when his and Waving Grass's own child was born lifeless. It was the one where he had so carelessly dumped Appletree's baby, a place where two souls resided. He always skirted that one with an uneasiness he could not explain. There lay what little conscience he had retained. He loaded the bales onto Mittig's sled and hitched the dogs to the harness. Snow or not, they would be made to pull the load. When he was done, he called out to Waving Grass that he was leaving. She stepped out on still shaky feet with a parflatch full of dry meat for his journey. "You will come back?" she asked in a strange tone. He nodded without looking up, packing another parflatch with powder and shot, as well as other things he might need. "I will be stronger when you return," she said in a slightly seductive voice. He looked at her, and a twinkle showed in his good eye. "So will I," he grinned. "I go now," he whispered as he casually embraced her. He drove the dogs south, following trails described by Mittig's neighbor during the winter months. Sometimes there was snow, and other times none. The trails would lead to the St. Croix River, where he would trade the sled and the dogs for a canoe that would take him all the way to the Mississippi River and on to New Orleans. He knew there was a good market for furs there because he had been there in his earlier ramblings. With the currents all going that way, he wouldn't have to work hard. When he traded with the Ojibwa for the canoe, they had warned him, "Take care as you pass the lands of the Sauk and the Fox, for Black Sparrowhawk is making war on the whites. The whites call it Black Hawk's War because he is the one stirring up the people to fight. Our brothers, the Potawatomi, have refused to fight and will help you if you are in danger." With those warnings, he set off, traveling by night and concealing himself in the canoe by day until he thought he was past Black Hawk's territory. Unfortunately, he miscalculated the distance he had traveled. The first morning that he chose to go on rather than hide, he received a shock when he looked upstream and saw, at some distance, 2 canoes gaining on him. They had the advantage of no fur bales and more paddlers. He looked ahead and saw the mouth of another river spilling into the one he was on, and with the last of his strength rounded the point and landed. He frantically pulled the canoe into the brush and covered himself in the craft in time to see the lead canoe come around the point. He was glad that spring had arrived earlier than farther north. The 2 canoes slowed as they went by, and the occupants jabbered back and forth in another of those languages he would never understand. He waited and watched, keeping to the shelter of his thicket. Once they rounded the next bend, he dashed back to the shore to obliterate the marks his canoe had made upon landing, that he had not seen before in his haste. He knew they would be back and was surprised that they had not seen the marks the first time. As the mid-morning sun began to warm the thicket and bring out the perfume of the forest, he dozed in a semi-alert state. It was well after noon when his eyes flashed open at a touch of cold steel at his throat and a hand over his mouth. "Don't move a muscle," the bearded face whispered into his ear. "They're all over the place, and you were starting to snore." Bear Claw lay perfectly still as the knife and the hand were removed. He asked many questions with his eyes, but only received more questions in return. He quietly sized up the man with the hazel eyes who had taken refuge with him. His gray hair stuck out of his knit cap at angles to his head, and the matching beard was halfway down his chest. They could hear the motion all around, the nearly silent motion of men searching for men. As the sounds retreated, Bear Claw began twisting his head back and forth to ease the tension of the awkward position he had maintained for so long. He sat up slowly as the stranger put a finger to his lips in caution. The man pointed through the undergrowth, and Bear Claw followed with his eyes to see the back of a young brave left behind to watch and listen. There would be several sentries left to alert the main party of any movement. The two white men would have to be as patient as Black Hawk's men were, and then some, if they hoped to survive. It was a long wait, full of many unasked questions whose answers would have to be postponed until the braves returned to their camp after dark. Finally, Bear Claw blew out his breath and was about to thank the stranger when he said, "Save it. We ain't safe yet. Let's get the hell out of here whilst we got the chance." They slid the canoe into the water and paddled as quietly as they could until they were well away from the confluence of the two rivers. They continued up the river, and as the sky began to lighten, the questions began to flow. "How'd you know I was in that thicket?" "I seen you land with them hot on your birch bark backside," said the stranger. "I knowed you'd be in trouble if I didn't help you out, so I worked my way over to you before they come back with a search party." He gave a knowing little laugh and added, "Just in time, too, by the sounds of your snoring." "I sure do thank you, stranger." They paddled on for a ways, and Bear Claw said, "By the way, I'm Alfred Simpson, but my friends call me Bear Claw. That how you got all chawed up?" "Yup, tangled with a bear out in Blackfoot country and won. They nursed me back to life and renamed me." "What's your name? I can't keep calling you stranger, not after you saved my life back there." "Elliot Pratt, simple as that," he said. After a silence filled with the swishing of paddles and waves lapping at the canoe, he continued, "Used to be a surveyor's helper. I worked with Pascal Enos back in '29. We laid out the town of Calhoun. Huh, ain't the same no more. Now they calls it Springfield, and they got the state capitol set up there." "Capital of what state?" Bear Claw asked. "Illinois, of course." Elliot stopped rowing and stared at the back of Bear Claw's head. "Where you been you don't know where you are? I mean, you been out there with them Injuns a long time?" "Yep, been learning how to trap and track real proper." "That where you got all them bales of furs?" "Yep. Should draw a pretty penny down New Orleans I ever get back to the Mississippi. Hell, you don't want to go back there lest you don't never want to collect on your efforts. Besides that, you'll draw more money with him by going to James Kinsey up in the Chicago River. He's got a cabin set up for trading over by Fort Dearborn. There ain't no government factors there no more, just private traders." "Better pull short and take cover," Bear Claw warned. "Sun's coming up." "Don't fret none. We're in Pottawatomie country now." After a moment, he added, "Don't suppose it'd hurt to rest a spell, though." They built up a small fire, and Elliot surprised Bear Claw by pulling all the makings for coffee out of his pack. "I ain't had coffee in a long time. You always carry it with you?" "Yup, wouldn't be without it." He laughed to himself as he set to work and then spoke his thoughts. "Funny thing is, they call that little village by Fort Dearborn the same as the river. Must really make the Injuns laugh, 'cause Chicago means smelly waters or oniony waters or some such name in their language." He looked sideways at Bear Claw as the water began to boil, and he asked, "Can you imagine naming your town Smelly Waters?" Bear Claw shook his head and shooed away the gnats. Elliot went on, "I got me a gut feeling that Chicago is going to be a big town someday, though. Why, there's already Easterners coming in there and buying up land. Speculators, they's called." He handed a steaming cup to Bear Claw. The two leaned back and speculated on the rest of the trip. Bear Claw found the going tedious and much to his dislike, for it meant constant work paddling upstream. He wondered to himself why he had decided to become a trapper of all things. It certainly wasn't a lazy man's work, but in a short time he'd have enough money to be as lazy as he liked. For that he'd do it. They paddled up the Illinois River to the Des Plaines River, called the O-Plain by some folk, then upstream some more, day after grueling day. "Just around that there bend and we'll stop for the day," Elliot said as the sun was setting behind them. "There's some folks I want to see there." They pulled ashore and beached the canoe next to a creek. After hiking a short distance up the creek through a gap in the bluff, they came to a village. The amount of fish carcasses drying between the lodges made it obvious it was a fishing village. Elliot pointed at the group waiting in the square and said, "That's the chief, the tall one. His name is Senego. The casket, or shaman, is the one next to him on the right. He's the one who talks to spirits. Senego's oldest daughter is on his other side. Last time I seen her she was only waist high, but there's no mistaking that beautiful face and those big, beautiful dark brown eyes. Hello, he said under his breath. Looks like there's a white man in camp. Greetings, my friend Senego, said Elliot as they approached the group. And to you, Elliot Pratt, simple as that, and to your friend. All the eyes of the welcoming party were fastened on the clipped nose and nearly closed, scar-covered eye of Bearclaw as the shaman leaned close to Senego and whispered into his ear. Senego waved him off as a distraction. You come now, we'll talk, Senego said to Elliot and Bearclaw. The resident white man fell into stride with them, possibly hoping to partake of a little white man talk. Senego's daughter followed along to see to the needs of the guests. Each time he was sure no one was looking, Bearclaw peeked back at the young woman, assessing the possibilities. He thought a little diversion with this maiden would be nice. There was much snow 2 winters ago, friend Elliot, Senego said as they seated themselves. Many of my people were cold and hungry. Did you lose many? Elliot asked with sincere concern in his voice. No, my people are strong. What of the white folks up in Neighbor Settlement? Elliot said. How did they do? Trapped like beavers in a snare for 2 months, but they lived. New experience for them. He laughed. Elliot turned to Bearclaw. Why don't you persuade this here young feller to tag along with you to Kinsey's in Fort Dearborn? Patted the young white man on the shoulder. I don't know, the white man said guardedly. What's your name? Bearclaw asked. Seamus looked back at the scarred man. Seamus O'Flaherty, but I couldn't leave Bright Moon now. Not just yet. Bring her along for company, Bearclaw said. The scars hid the twinkle in his eye. Seamus turned to Bright Moon and asked, Would you like to go? I will follow where you go, husband, she said with obvious love in her voice. Then it's settled, Bearclaw said, slapping his hands together with glee. Senego turned back to Elliot as Bearclaw, suddenly full of charm, began describing his journey to Bright Moon and Seamus. But Seamus was more interested in what Senego was saying to Elliot. There are more white settlers coming, friend Elliot. They are close to our winter hunting camp, and they are up the DuPage River a day's walk in a new settlement called Barber's Corner. They are friends of Captain Neighbor. Don't you think, Seamus? Bearclaw was asking. I'm sorry, I was listening to Senego. What did you ask? I asked if we could paddle all the way to the fort. Only in the early spring when Mud Lake floods. But it's too early and the waters are still down, so we'll have to portage 5 or 6 miles to get to the Chicago River. Seamus's attention was again drawn to the other conversation. Elliot was speaking. I warn the settlers as I go, but I'll bet they won't go to the fort. Senego, my good friend, if Black Sparrow Hawk does come this far, will your people help the settlers? Shibona thinks we should, Senego said. I think we should, too. I'm tired of wars, and Black Hawk's war on the white man is useless. If he continues, we will all be forced to leave these lands. We have proven that we can live in peace with each other. French traders have married our women for years. My own daughter has a white husband. What more can we do to prove that we accept the river's current and will flow with it? He glanced at Seamus and nodded thanks for the use of his phrase. Yes, we will help the settlers against Black Hawk. I will speak with Aptekisik about this also. Seamus admired the eloquence of his father-in-law, the man of a race the whites called savage, and who commanded 2 white tongues as well as several Indian dialects. Seamus knew that every day he spent among Bright Moon's people was embarrassing for Senego, because of those who opposed the union of the red and the white skin and the difference of beliefs. He made up his mind in that moment and turned back to Bearclaw. We'll go with you, he said firmly. He relaxed once the decision was made, and Bright Moon gently laid her hand on his arm. She smiled at him with her eyes. He could tell she knew it was the best for all concerned and gave her approval with that small gesture. Seamus leaned back to listen to Elliot. He was telling about a fight he had observed. It was down in New Salem, a fairly new settlement on the Sangamon River. Well, first off, there was this bunch of rowdies that called themselves the Clary's Grove Boys, and one of them was this big, burly fellow called Jack Armstrong. I swear he was the strongest feller I ever did lay eyes on. Then there was this storekeeper, Denton Offit, his name was. He spouts off about how his clerk could lick any man around. His clerk was an outsider to boot who come from Kentucky. Thought it was kind of funny, 'cause I'd seen this feller Abe Lincoln several times, and he always seemed quiet to me. Well, anyway, they finally had a wrestling match that lasted and lasted. Why, they'd still be trying to throw each other around if this Abe feller hadn't said, Jack, let's quit. I can't throw you, and you can't throw me. I tell you, he ain't no outsider no more. That kind of man ain't no outsider nowhere. Got what you'd call a quiet strength to him. I like a feller what's strong and still sensible. He eyed Seamus and said, You kind of strike me as being that sort yourself, young feller. That's what put me in mind of the story. Why, you ain't said 2 words since we got here. Seamus fidgeted a little as they all looked at him. I haven't had much to say. I don't know all these people you're talking about, so I figured it's just best to keep shut about them. That's true enough, Elliot said. Never smear a name you don't know. He tossed a twig into the fire. You folks better get some shut-eye or you won't get very far on Mud Lake tomorrow.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.